Hello. Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for coming this afternoon. Even despite the severe storm warning, we show what the metal us New Englanders are made out of. Again, welcome. Part of our Meet the Authors series, we continue today. I'd like to ask if you could turn off your cell phones and pagers. I'll give you a minute because it can be disruptive, so I'll give you a moment. Thank you. This afternoon we'll be talking New England Patriots, or rather, I should say that we'll be talking about Patriots of New England. We'll also be hearing about pirates and privateers. Our Meet the Author series continues here at the library. Today, the book is Patriot Pirates, The Privateer War for Freedom and Fortune in the American Revolution. It's a sweeping and fascinating look at revolutionary life and privateering. Privateering, not a word in our everyday language today. During the American Revolution, empowered by the Continental Congress, it was licensed piracy, a business really. The author's exhaustive research, coupled with his fine art of narrative, resulted in this extremely readable book. Not only does he tell an absorbing and historic tale, he brings a real humanity to American heroes and scoundrels alike. Many of you know our speaker today as he's a Darien resident. You probably also know that he's the grandson of General George S. Patton. He's the author of The Pattons, A Personal History of an American Family, Life Between Wars, and Up, Down, and Sideways. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Robert H. Patton.
Thanks, Barbara. Appreciate it. Hello, everybody. Appreciate being here. Particularly want to thank Barbara for the nice introduction, and Luis Berry and everyone here, Janet and others at the library. I'm not telling anybody here anything that they don't know. That this is a great library. They were very helpful. The staff was very helpful to me in finding some obscure sources, some magazine articles written 30, 40, 50 years ago from various academic journals no longer in print. And as I say, I'm sure everybody here knows this from their own experience, but I can't, I have to add my voice one more time. Thank you all at the Darien Library for helping me out with this book. Before I start talking about it, well, first of all, I have to note there's a lot of people here that I recognize and know well, and so the pressure's on here, so we'll find out if it makes me less nervous or more nervous. It'll be an interesting experiment that we can all make a judgment of later. But I appreciate you all coming. Even writers of more stature than myself have said that when you write a book and you spend a lot of time in your lair doing your research and writing, it's a pretty isolated experience. And when the book comes out, it feels sometimes as if you just dropped a pebble in the ocean and it disappears. And events like these, and some of the bookstores I've been going to, and other talks, it gives a writer a nice sense of a ripple being created, and it's very gratifying. And I want to thank you all for giving that to me tonight. I also have to thank, as I do whenever I can, as often as I can, my lovely wife, who bears with all the crazy isolation and living in my lair at home, and allows me to get books like this done at their own pace. And, Vicki, thanks, as usual. Really appreciate it. I'll give you a little bit of background, again, before I get to the substance of what this book is about, Revolutionary War Privateering, how it came to be. I had, as Barbara mentioned, I wrote a book about my grandfather and family. It came out 10 years plus ago. And after that, I published 2 novels. That had been my original plan, my original love, to write aspiringly literary novels. And I did so. My kind agent helped me place them. They were fairly small publishers. They were very nicely reviewed. And I think, other than my wife, probably only the reviewers read them. But I think of them as children I love. And I had begun a third one, and was talking to my poor, long-suffering agent about it. And we were talking, and his name is Harvey. And I said, Harvey, I've got this idea for a new novel about, suburban hijinks and pitfalls. And you could hear the heavy sigh on the other side. How am I going to do this? There's not enough of those out there, are there? And so he said, well, what else you got, Bob? And I said, well, not much. I said, I was helping my son with his homework, though, the other day. And this goes back a couple of years now. And oddly enough, I came across this reference in his history book about Revolutionary War privateers harassing British trade during the Revolution, and how the British thought they were pirates. And he goes, stop. So that's the next book. And I said, well, I don't know anything about it. I said, I was raised on the Civil War. I don't know that much about the Revolution, other than the usual touchstones of Bunker Hill and Paul Revere and Yorktown. He said, I don't care. He said, go to the internet, get some information, go to the library, back to the library, and get me a proposal. And he says, and above all, make sure that pirate is in the title. So that's what I almost did. When I originally turned in the proposal, I did not put pirate. It was called The Jolly Fellows, which I took off an old Revolutionary War broadside or poster advertising for a crew to come and join a particular privateer, and they were saying, any jolly fellows out there, come and join our happy crew. So I took that as the title originally, but Patriot Pirates occurred to me sort of en route to the finished book, because it really did set off the themes which came to be very important to me within the book. I can testify that it has some wonderful, cool battles in it, and it's all about, if you love sea stories, it's full of sea stories. If you love great characters, revolutionary notables, and scoundrels, as Barbara said, it's got them. But the thing that carried it for me ultimately was the theme of patriotism versus, again, we'll use it figuratively in a larger way, piracy. Now, the privateers, as I'll explain in a moment, were not actual pirates legally, but they were very close to it. The British thought they were, but they technically were not. But the book explores a theme of that was as current, that I think is as current today in its way as it was obviously then, of patriotism, i.e. service, giving to one's country, doing for others, versus self-interest, capitalism, entrepreneurialism. Obviously those are versions of a kind of piracy. We won't call it capitalism piracy, but we know what I'm saying. That theme brought the colonial type of person to me in a way that had not been done before. I could understand it in a modern way, because I think all of us make those same kinds of calculations all the time. Do we do for others today, or do we go and earn our paycheck? And there's always the back and forth. And so that, for me, was a way to get to understand a distant generation that I had not understood in any kind of personal way before. So that is why Patriot Pirates came to mean something for me, and as I complete the circle about the title, that is how it came to be. So let's start with a little explanation about how the phenomenon of privateering was introduced to the Revolutionary War. In the fall of 1775, George Washington was in a stalemate, and the Continental Army were in a stalemate trying to lay siege to Boston. He had a ragtag group of militia called the Continental Army on the heights of Boston, overlooking Boston Harbor. And in the city, in the town, really, were about 6,000 loyalists and British soldiers. They couldn't break out. He couldn't muster enough of firepower to attack. He had not enough men, and he had not enough munitions. He is trying to decide what to do during this stalemate period in the early and late fall of 1775. He's getting a lot of advice. He's from Virginia, remember. He goes up to Massachusetts, and in those days you could write a letter to His Excellency and often get it to him. And I just wanted one little funny letter that was just a representative of the kind of thing that he would get, came to him while he was casting about for some tactical operation that he might do simply to put a dent in the British the British occupation. And here's the letter that came to him. The guy is saying, he says, I have a great plan to torch all of the Royal Navy battleships and frigates and transports that are anchored and coming into Boston Harbor. So you can imagine he might have sat forward, George Washington, in his seat as he received this letter. And here's what the guy says. He says, I'm going to give you my plan, but you have to pay me first. And here's how he puts it. Not without an advantage in proportion to the service I may do. But then this is the part that amuses me. He says, to discuss his fee, he says, you can contact me, and here he's writing, at a local coffee house, care of Mr. Hugh James, the barkeeper. So this is who's writing George Washington with their plans of attack on the mighty Royal Navy. Well, another piece of advice that he does get is to launch private warships against these incoming transports, and it will serve a dual purpose. It will, of course, whatever munitions they're bringing in, whatever supplies, that can go to his very, very beleaguered and ragtag Continental Army, but it also will provide a psychological uplift to the forces who are, you know, very bogged down outside Boston. He's always facing enlistments coming due at the end of the year, always fearful he's going to lose his men, and so this will be a nice emotional charge if they have a good capture. And he decides to arm with his what few supplies he has about a dozen Continental schooners, war schooners. These are Continental in the sense that they were manned by military men. The skippers were local watermen, local navigators and such. As he does that, the Massachusetts provincial government decides to do the same thing. So they're going to have, under their auspices, theoretically legalized private warships or citizen / some military, some militia manned vessels going offshore and hijacking and bringing into other free ports whatever British supplies they can that are all incoming into Boston. The dozen or so schooners that Washington gets to see are pretty much a disaster. It's a Keystone Cops operation. He has a fellow named Nicholson Broughton who gets his orders from Washington, and the only order that he really locks into is that there's no need to attack the Royal Navy. So he loves that. He doesn't want to do any fighting. He's got 4 ships underneath him. He goes off. He's afraid to go too far to sea because he's not very experienced. He has all of his family members in positions of command on these various vessels. He's got his half-brother. He's got his cousin. He's got his son is on his ship. And he gets complaints from Washington's office, but he, you know, this is how the society works in those days, the business. You put your friends in power. It's completely nepotistic. And nobody really comments on it. But anyway, Broughton is among the first, and he goes and he brings in quite a nice load of small transports that are plying up and down the American coastline. Well, it turns out that almost all of them are owned by patriotic colonial Americans. He's just grabbing them and bringing them in triumph, and so he has to give them back. Washington has to deal with all the paperwork, and not only does he have to give them back, he has to replenish all the pilfered goods which have been taken by the crews and whoever else was at the waterfront when these vessels were brought in. So Washington has a letter where he says, a more disorderly set I have never seen, and he essentially says, I cannot deal with this much longer, and he doesn't. But there is one, really two, but I'll talk about one. There is one major score that comes out of this in December, actually late November 1775. One of his vessels lucks into the capture of a huge inbound British military ordnance ship carrying gunpowder, carrying huge mortars, carrying cannons. This is a major, major military trove that they get. To give you a sense of how it was valued within the continent with the Continental Patriots as a whole, the first week it's assessed. People are saying it's worth 10,000 pounds. It's at least worth 10,000 pounds. The fortunes of these men on this small schooner, this Continental schooner, are made. 2 weeks later, we have a letter from Thomas Jefferson referring to it. He said, it's worth 30,000 pounds. You know, it's already escalating in rumored value, and he says, this is going to turn the tide of the war. So they're embracing this. This is huge news. This is huge news. In fact, it was finally assessed at about 25,000 pounds. In those days, to give you some perspective, you could support a pretty large family in Boston for about 40 pounds sterling a year. So if you're talking 20,000, 30,000 sterling, this is a massive amount of money. In fact, the crew of this Continental schooner got nothing, because what happened, it was so needed by the military, the goods were just completely requisitioned, dispersed, and it wasn't ever appraised until almost a year later, based on whatever paperwork they had left that hadn't been lost in the thicket of sort of, Revolutionary War accounting. And this became, so it has this had a double purpose. It enlivened, it empowered the military. It gave a real charge to many patriots who were, doubtful of how things would proceed. But it also put the word out that if you worked for the government, you didn't get paid. And this began to become very much a part of the popular thinking when, in March of 1776, Congress, having heard about some of the successes, the few successes, but big ones, that have been made up in New England, decides to legalize privateering. And it does so reluctantly, and I'll explain why in a minute. But just as a result of Congress doing this, and when they passed their rule, which was an act for the fixing out of private warships to plunder the enemy, the British enemy, Britain gets word of it. It's published in the papers there as almost a joke. And one of the editorials says, reports it as almost like a gossip item, a political curiosity. The quaint Continental Congress has passed this odd little act about, empowering American warships, and, the subtext being, isn't it silly of them, and it can do them no good whatsoever. But in fact, the phrase I use in the book is, what is born out of this is nothing less than a huge seaborne insurgency. And I'll throw a few numbers at you briefly, just to give you a little sense of what I'm talking about. In the revolution as a whole, the Continental Navy, once it got constituted, launched 8 frigates total. It was supposed to do 13, it launched 8. None of them survived the war. I think only 2 of them were lost in battle. The others were just more or less fell apart because they were so badly built. The Congress got 50 other ships under a naval flag to sea, big ones, small ones. These were all converted fishing or trade vessels. 11 survived the war, and again, a very non-noteworthy record of combat within the revolution. I'll interject right now that none of this is disrespectful. There may be Navy men in the audience of the Continental Navy. John Paul Jones was certainly the most capable and the most aggressive, and probably the single most successful commerce raider on the ocean in those days. He was a straight-up Continental Navy man. But in terms of the strategic influence on the war and its impact on the British economy, the historical consensus is absolute. The Continental Navy was a non-factor. It just did not have any capability in terms of numbers and firepower to do anything to the Royal Navy. So we'll contrast those few ships of the Navy versus the privateers. In Massachusetts alone, at least 2,000 were commissioned. Okay, you have at least, we'll say dozens, probably closer to 200, came out of ports in the West Indies. Once we had some American agents down there that were allowed to empower and pull together crews and call them American privateers. Later they came out of France, and they came out of, again, sometimes initially under American flags, then under French ones, once French declared for America in the late stage of the war. Thousands there. You can look at the casualties, an unfortunate index, but nonetheless a pertinent one. The Continental Navy lost 832 men in combat. The privateers lost thousands. At least 12,000 died in the prison ships in the East River off Brooklyn, Wallabout Bay, because that's where most of them were taken, and I'll explain why in a minute. So, untold thousands. One has to look merely at the rolls of the towns which were the cradle of privateering in New England, which is north of Boston, Essex, Salem, Beverly, Newburyport. They lost dozens of privateers. You see widows applying for aid after the war. You have orphan children. It's huge. And again, because this is this somewhat peripheral, not very well documented enterprise, the best and most sort of careful historians can only say untold thousands died. The Continental Navy logged 198 prizes, captured vessels. In America alone, the privateers brought in 600. They brought in another 600 in the West Indies, and probably close to another 600 in Europe late in the war. So again, a huge amount of impact. That's all British trade ships that are affecting directly the British economy and the merchants. Inflation goes up in Britain because costs are harder to bring in, are harder to find, and insurance for maritime trade goes through the roof. About 5 times the level that it had reached during the French and Indian War in 1763. And this is major news in Britain. This is what the editorials are about. They're not about too much about the fighting on Long Island, as bloody and as important as it was, say, of the Continental Army. It was about why are my goods from Europe, not from Europe, from the West Indies, from the New World, why are they 3 times the cost than they should be? This is what you see in newspapers today. That's what we all react to, gas prices and such, and that's what was on their minds, and that's who put pressure on the government as the war went on. I said Congress was reluctant to get to license privateers. Well, they were reluctant for these reasons. Number one, they thought it would drain manpower, ammunitions, away from any potential Continental Navy that they might try to launch. They thought it would be an absolute vehicle of social decline. One of the representatives, I think it was from New Hampshire, said there is no human business so contributes to the decline of morals. And this was very much a part of a genteel, aristocratic view of privateers as just basically lawless rabble. Those things were true. It did drain manpower. It did call in an unruly element. John Paul Jones saw it right away. He loved his Navy. He was a Navy man, and I'm going to touch on a little something in my book, that an exchange between him and some merchants in Rhode Island that he was operating against. He had, in about 1776, the 5-vessel Continental Navy at that time was stationed in Providence. John Paul Jones was with it for a while, then he left right before Rhode Island was invaded at the end of 1776, and the whole Navy was basically bottled up. He was at war with local Providence merchants because they were draining off his manpower and they were draining off his munitions. Because it's important to remember, unlike today, the government was just one buyer. If there was a load of cannon brought in from who knows where, if it was captured on a ship or it had been brought in through the West Indies, the government had to bid against a local merchant. There was no sense of, the government has to get it, they're fighting a war. If the merchant could pay more and could get the guy to sell to him, to arm his privateer rather than let the government have it, he won. This was the way business was done then, and it infuriated John Paul Jones, just drove him up the wall. And here's the exchange he had with, well, here's his view generally of privateers. He says, the common class of mankind are actuated by no nobler principle than that of self-interest. This and this only determine all adventurers and privateers, the owners as well as those whom they employ. So then he starts getting mad because his own sailors are starting to jump ship and getting onto privateers in Providence. He's furious at this. So, while stationed there with his 5-vessel Continental Fleet in the fall of 1776, Jones raged at those who, quote, wink at, encourage, and employ deserters from the Navy. In frustration, he took matters into his own hands, calling for the execution of deserters and employing surprise inspections to snatch away servicemen who jumped ship to private vessels. Now, the businessmen howl. If a young captain didn't desist, they said, division, confusion, and frequent bloodletting must be the inevitable consequence. He next, this is all in letters and in the paper, he curses their hypocrisy. What punishment is equal to such baseness? And yet these men pretend to love their country. It's not done. They then write to the Congress and they say, they call him what is the worst thing you can call a mariner in those days. Captain Jones has been guilty of an act of piracy. So you've got Jones calling them pirates, and you've got the businessman saying he's a pirate. This is going on all the time, this exact argument. Why is it popular? We know now why Congress was reluctant. Why is it so popular? Well, the number one reason, when Washington first empowered his schooners, and then when Congress did it with licenses, a privateer under government auspices got to keep 1/3 of the value of whatever they took, and 2/3 went to the government. 1/3, therefore, would be divided among the captain who got the most, and the surgeon got the second most, right on down to the cabin boy who got his few shillings of whatever it was, his share. A privateer, the civilian privateer, got it all, 100%. Now, if the owner owned the ship, he had the 100%, and then he would set up his deals with his captain and his crewmen. He could parse it out any way he wanted. But it doesn't take an economics major to understand that your incentive is entirely with the group that's going to get it all, rather than the people who are risking, life and limb to get 1/3. And they were risking life and limb because that's another reason why privateering was popular, because privateers were not obligated, due to the uniform they wore, to take on the Royal Navy warships. In fact, their owners wanted them to get out of there. If they saw a British frigate, they said, do not take it on. Go away and wait for something unarmed that you can get easily and then send it back to me to sell. That's what their mission was. And then they would get credit for it once they came back to shore. Another reason why privateers were so popular. Also, enlistments in privateering with a civilian merchant or ship owner were one voyage at a time. So you signed up, you did your trip, a month, 2 months, whatever it might be. You come back. If you had your money, you got your share. If you had no money, you didn't get anything. If you were killed, your family may or may not, depending on what the agreement was, might have gotten a little stipend, perhaps not. But the short-term enlistment, unlike a continental enlistment, which was for 6 months or a year, gave those civilian privateers a lot of leverage. If their owner didn't pay them quickly for a prize that was brought in, there was no reason to sign up with them again, and the owners knew it. So they sometimes would pay even if they hadn't cashed out the prize yet. And then, whereas the government, the Continental Congress, was terrible about paying people. Terrible. They had no money. So, as I said, the huge score that had been made by one of Washington's Continental schooners early on They got nothing of that, ultimately 25,000 pounds sterling. Again, this makes privateering by far the choice of the majority of would-be mariners. Interestingly, in Boston, General William Howe, the British general, sees this, and he knows there's going to be a problem. So he says what the answer is to treat privateers differently than anyone that we capture at sea under a Navy flag. And here's what he said. I'm going to dig out my little spot here. He's writing in December 1775. And here's what he writes back to his, some of his influential friends in Britain. Because he writes this on the eve of actually a continental privateer, one of Washington's early ones that were captured. He has an idea about what to do with this crew that's been captured. Uncertainty about the fate of their crew would deter others from privateering. I would wish a distinction to be made between prisoners taken on sea in this way, which last mode of war, as he put it, will hurt us much more effectually than anything they can do by land during our stay at this place. What he's asking is for privateers to be treated differently because he's saying they're basically unconventional warriors. Navy men, under rules of war, we have to treat them as prisoners of war. We have to give them a right of trial. We have to treat them in a certain way with certain basic rights and amenities, and they're entitled to a prisoner exchange at some point in the war. He said, let's do differently with the privateers. And this is indeed what was done, because 15 months later, the Prime Minister of England, Frederick North, puts through Congress, it was called North Acts, it's also called the Pirate Act, and what this does is it removes any rights of habeas corpus for the privateers that are captured. They can be held indefinitely, they can be held, they can be summarily hanged. Not a lot were, but that threat was always there, and they had no right to exchange whatsoever. And I don't dwell on it in my book, but I always find it interesting, and now's not the forum to go on the rights and wrongs, but it's always interesting to say, boy, that sounds a little bit like what America's gone through with Guantanamo. I mean, we've recognized that we had an unconventional warrior, combatant. We're going to treat them in a different way because they're an unconventional combatant. And we could say, well, they had the reasons, or they didn't have the reasons, but we can understand how this would become part of a social fracture, whereas people might say, this is not good for who we are and how we think of ourselves, and this is wrong in terms of human rights. And that exact argument goes on in Britain immediately. This immediately becomes a cause célèbre within the country. People saying this is that you're denying human rights to American privateers first. When will we be next? And it becomes attached to the anti-war movement, and the same track follows. And as I say, without even taking a judgment or verdict about it, it's interesting to see that sort of there's nothing new under the sun sometimes. The same debate exactly goes through England about how do you treat unconventional warriors when you capture them at sea. Do you or do you not owe them the rights that we give to men on uniform and under a flag? The precise argument. Very interesting to see. Why did Britain do this? What gave them, what enthused people to do this? Well, they did it because they were really, really ticked off about the unconventional warriors, about what was being done. And I'm going to read two very quick snippets about two interpretations of very similar events. And the event has to do with when privateers sometimes were coming, when the British enemy was bearing down on in the Royal Navy. They wanted to get out of town. They were not there to fight. That was for the Navy men to do. So they would abandon their ship if they couldn't get it to shore and trade it in for prize money. And they tended to booby trap them as well. And here's the American side of things first. I talk about a captain named Lambert Wicks, who again was one of these hybrid. He was in the Continental Navy most of the time, did little time on privateers. For those of you who know your revolutionary history, he actually brought Benjamin Franklin in 1776 to Europe. But he also made a trip with an American political agent down to the West Indies. So he comes into the book in that regard. And here's what he says, what I say about him. A month earlier in Rhode Island, Lambert Wicks and his brother Richard had helped unload more than 100 barrels of gunpowder off a stranded American blockade runner. They were actually helping the blockade runner. As British longboats approached, the Americans had abandoned ship after furling 50 pounds of powder inside a canvas sail, creating a time delay fuse which they lighted near the vessel's remaining cargo of unloaded ammunition. Redcoats from two of the longboats, quote, soon boarded her, and this is a British witness writing now, soon boarded her. One was close under the stern, the others very near. Those on board had given 3 cheers and fired their arms after our people when the fire took effect on the powder and sent 30 to 40 of them up into the air. The transport was blown to bits. Body parts and debris of British Navy men rained down on the water. in horrified rage, the British frigate starts blasting off cannon shots at the retreating Americans. Lambert Wicks' brother is killed. He sees this as an utter injustice. He's furious, and it completely motivates him the rest of the war. He says, the British murdered my brother, essentially is how he regards this. The British, on the other hand, take the same kind of event and see this as an absolute atrocity. And Parliament, of course, hears these reports and has no problem voting in this Pirate Act. And because here's what here's the story you're getting in Britain of the same kind of event. Okay, this is the British captain writing, and he says he deplores the privateer trick of rigging abandoned vessels with what he calls them combustibles. It creates a scene, quote, horrible to behold, he said. It went off like the sound of a gun, blew the boat into pieces, and sent her into flame. These reports go to Britain. You have, in Parliament, they're decrying the privateers' unmanly way of fighting. They're bragging cowardly banditti. They fight outside the laws of God and man. These are all quotes out of parliamentary proceedings. They deserve all the horrors of rebellion, by which is meant no mercy. Consequently, it's no-brainer. They passed that Pirate Act, robbing privateers of all rights without a problem. But that act creates problems within Britain, and it contributes to an ongoing debate, political debate domestically in Britain about whether the war should be continued or not. That's not the only thing that Britain does to get back at these terrible, unconventional, guerrilla-like American fighters. They reinstitute the press, impressment, in their own society because 15,000 members of their Navy before the Revolution were Americans. So they all go to America. They're back there. A lot of their vessels, which had been partly affiliated with the British Navy operations that were still in America, run down one flag and run up the other. And so Britain needs men and needs more Navy now to take on this massive seaborne insurgency that's going on. So they put an impressment. They begin to kick up. And the impressment is, for those of you that know, that's basically forcible coercion to join a Navy ship. They would send, the British Royal Navy would send crews into downtown and pluck people out of the workplace, march them onto a ship, you're on the ship, off to go to sea, and then be back in a year or two. That was it. And it was often done offshore, and it was allowed, but it was really socially volatile, obviously, in the country. And again, this contributes to this anti-war feeling going on within Britain. That it's bringing the war home to them. You know, they're taking my son. He was minding his business at work, and now he's God knows where, in the West Indies somewhere. This is what Britain has to do. It also takes a very difficult step for it at the time, which was to empower privateers of its own. And this is fighting fire with fire. And they decide, particularly in the West Indies, where there are a lot of British citizens, sailors, a lot of trade goes through the West Indies, they finally King George allows British privateers to get licenses and attack. And within my book, these are the most bloody battles, because this privateer against privateer, when they would meet one another, both are trying to capture the other, both of them thinking the other is going to treat them as a complete pirate, so if they're captured, they're going to be hanged. And one very, very bloody battle in which the two ships got tangled up in one another's rigging. These are two privateers, and are basically unloading volleys from about 4 feet away from one another for over 2 hours. And afterward, one of the survivors on the American side said, though it was fought with ferocity rather than bravery. And he doesn't elaborate. It's an interesting, sometimes when you read the diaries of this period, you wish they would be more Freudian and kind of spill it all out. You know, what was it like? But they don't. They don't quite have that way. Some of the most god-awful engagements, a British soldier will say, well, it was a warm engagement, you know, and then that'll be it. You wish, come on, there's got to be more here, you know. But so you have to dig in and you find out what it is. But so when one diary entry said it was fought with ferocity rather than bravery, I thought, you know, God knows, you know, it was atrocities. Were they bludgeoning one another as prisoners? But it just was just a horrible incident at sea, and there were many like this when British privateers ran into American privateers. I told my agent when he called, or when we talked about this and he sent me off on this journey of writing this book, that I really didn't know all that much about the Revolution beyond what everybody else knew. And, you know, he said, never mind, write the book about pirates. And, but since then, and as I wrote it, I found, and I was talking with Bob Wells, who's here a minute ago about it, I decided to let my ignorance be my guide in writing this book. And maybe I let that guide me in all my life, I don't know. But, and what I mean by that is where privateering took me, because I didn't really feel beholden because I hadn't studied in college. I was an English lit major. You know, to any of the high points that all of us sort of know, but yet don't know in a way. I think you all know what I mean. So, by having this kind of ignorance before me, and I'll go where privateering takes me. It took me in a very sort of comprehensible way. I mean, it's not a very long book, as you'll see, compared to some real tomes on the war. It takes me very neatly through three theaters of the war. And I'm just going to give you a little touch about the narrative overview, and then I'm going to talk about one other person, and then I think hopefully you'll have a sense of what maybe the book is about if you're inclined to take a look at it. But it very neatly takes you through three hugely important theaters of the war. It begins in New England, that's the cradle of privateering. It then takes you down to the West Indies. Now, the West Indies, where I stumbled on a one-line comment in a middle school history book, is a huge factor. It's the hub of British trade out of the New World. Ships are plying back and forth, multiple flags, British, Dutch, French, Spanish, all moving through this area. You've got British colonies in Antigua is their main one. That's where their Admiralty Court is. They have a very large shipyard there. France has Martinique. The Dutch have St. Eustatia. Spain is in Cuba. This is a major trading area between New World goods, and don't forget slaves coming back from Africa being traded for rum, sugar, all the goodies that are in West Indies that are going to go back to Europe. So this privateers, once Boston falls, once it's evacuated, the scene moves south. New York is partly still in play because New York is three-quarters loyalist, and it always stays largely under loyalist command and occupation during the war. The scene moves to the West Indies. West Indies becomes a real powder keg, political powder keg, because it's easier to violate treaty agreements between France and Britain in the West Indies than in the English Channel. So it takes you there, and there are hundreds of privateers operating through here. British trade goes through there. Very important. British newspapers at the time are full of talk about what's happening to our West Indian trade. It's getting destroyed, decimated. So again, the book takes you there. Who knew? I mean, I didn't, that it was that important. And then, of course, it moves to Europe. And it moves to Europe because Americans, the commissioners there, led by Benjamin Franklin, used privateering to gnaw at the ostensible alliance, at least a friendship, between Britain and France. And if you are allowing privateers to come into the French mainland, refit, and take off real quickly, and then go hit a British ship, even if you send that British ship, that capture back to the States, it's not going to please the British. And then if you commit the real effrontery of bringing a captured British vessel into a French port secretly, selling it, disposing it, and there are plenty of French merchants that are willing to do it, and then get out of there real quickly, that also is going to aggravate the alliance between France and Britain. And Benjamin Franklin exploits this masterfully. All of his outward letters, we deplore any violations, you know, this is just terrible. And then his other letter to Continental Congress, things are going great. They're coming in here, we're selling all kinds of ships, they can't stop us. And it's very much, privateering brings in a very kind of visceral and easy to understand way what was going on in terms of that, working that alliance, that friendship between France and Britain, and get it to the breaking point, which finally we did, and which was crucial to getting Britain finally to capitulate and allow us to leave. And in addition to those three theaters, privateering very neatly took me, I won't speak for you, took me through three very neat thematic tracks. The first is strategic. We've already talked about that. The other is political. I can touch on that as well. British-French relations. In America, you've got a situation going on in Congress. It goes back to the original debate about privateering. Self-interest versus patriotism. Should we make them all join the Navy, or should we empower privateers to create an instant Navy for us? What should we do? And this debate continues right through the war. All kinds of allegations arise about corruption among privateers, American politicians, men in great power in the Continental Congress who they said are using the public money to invest in privateers. And this is a dialogue which eventually, at the end of the war, differentiates into a kind of a larger discussion, which was very much a part of the formative years as we were moving toward establishing a constitution, about what is the role of capitalism in our society. The privateering element in Massachusetts are, much more inclined to promote capitalism. They're much more inclined to see it as a glue, which will hold us together if we all are partners and working together. And there are then the others that maybe come out of the agrarian group down in the Jefferson and the Lees in Virginia, who think this is an unruly element. It's not part of that landed aristocracy that they thought America would be this kind of pastoral republic with a very low emphasis on capitalism. This conversation is very important to America, I discovered, and it kind of originates in the debates within Congress about what does privateering really mean to who we are as Americans. And then economic. The American economy during the Revolution was hammered. The Congress had no money, so it did the easy thing, which was to print money. And they printed tons and tons of continental dollars. The continental dollar lost 90% of its value, more than 90% in the first 3 years of the war. So if you had a good strike with a privateer, there was no investment instrument you could really buy very easily. You could go into more business, you could build a nice big mansion for yourself, or you could get another privateering expedition going. So it becomes a self-perpetuating entrepreneurial circle, and that was good for the American economy. It was very good for the American economy at a time when really not much else was. This study kind of awakens me to the idea of what was making Americans tick at the time, and still does, I think. A lot of people don't know, certainly I didn't, that the economy in America before the Revolution was very good, better than in Britain. We were not very highly taxed comparative to what European developed nations were facing. So as I put in the book, in fiscal terms, what Americans wanted, what drove them to revolution, was not a desire for financial freedom, as I had always thought. It was a desire for more financial freedom. They wanted more. And that was this American idea about Britain is giving us what we call salutary neglect. They're letting us be a little bit on the edges of illegal commerce. We're bringing in some rum. We're doing some things. We bring in our tea. And Britain's letting that happen because it's good for Britain. It means income for them overall. But we want more. That's not enough. And this really motivates us to move toward declaring independence, and it really motivates the privateers. The last thing, it changes American business practices in ways that I didn't realize. Before the Revolution, business was done in America by families primarily. Nicholas Brown and Son, so-and-so and brothers. You trusted your family, and very rarely did you go outside the family. This was just the way it was done. The privateering, specifically privateering, introduces the idea of conglomerates and partnerships because you could hedge bets, you had multiple people that could buy shares, you could buy a 16th share of a privateer. If it was just like a good stock, if they had a good captain, if it was a good ship, you paid more. If it was considered it was probably going to sink outside the jetty, you could get it cheap. And this was very much like a stock market, and it acclimated Americans to working in partnerships. The other thing is, you had insurance firms that developed, particularly out of Boston. People began to insure privateering expeditions. And this became, some of the wealthiest people that came out of the war were not the people that were crewing privateers, were not the people that were even owning the privateers. It was the brokers that managed the sales, it was the brokers that put partnerships together, and it was the insurers. They were the ones, because it's that old story, instead of playing the game, they owned the game. And it was very much a kind of a prototype of what I think all of us think of it as American, sort of an American business model today. And then finally, in a dark sense, after the war, there is a dip in the economy, as happens after wars. You have a very, very capable mariner element in New England. You have great ships. You've got great captains. You've got crews sitting around. What are we going to do? There's no war anymore. And a lot of them went back into the slave trade. And this slave trade is originating out of New England, where, of course, slavery and slaves are illegal. So this is the triangular trade. And I think most of us know how it works. And it started before the war as well. Let's start in New England. You send your rum that you've distilled. Rhode Island had about 50 distilleries, little Rhode Island, to Europe. You sell that for cash. You then slide down to the African coastline. You pick up your African slaves. You bring them to the West Indies. You pick up your molasses and your sugar cane. You bring that back up to New England. You then make your rum and your other spirits. And you send it here, and you never see an African. And yet you are obviously very much a part of the African trade. After the Revolution, between the Revolution and the Civil War, 3/5 of all slave ships originated out of Rhode Island. 3/5 came from Rhode Island. Only a few families. This is the only time you deviate from this idea of partnerships. The families that were involved in the slave trade heavily after the war, and as you look in the documentation, many of the slave ships were either converted privateers or converted privateer captures. So it's a direct correlation about how it fed into this. Those families generally kept it quiet. They worked among themselves. Some of the names, Grafton in Boston, DeWolf in Providence, Rhode Island, They did a huge amount. Then there are the Browns. Brown University is named for John Brown and his brothers. He, of the three brothers, was very active in the slave trade and made a fortune at it, and both before the war and afterwards. So you see this American economical influence of privateering also here. Ignorance led me through the book in these ways. The other thing that led me through the book, and I'll just touch it, I'm about to wind up here, is the characters that I followed. And again, I'm happy to write a book or read a book about George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, who all play a significant role in my book, but the characters that emerged through my raw material of study were some other names, and I had a good time sort of getting to know them and bringing them to the fore in this particular book. For example, Nathaniel Greene from Rhode Island. A lot of you may know Nathaniel Greene as a well-known general, considered to be Washington's best. He really made his great name militarily in the Southern campaign after Yorktown and after France had come into the war. While he was down there becoming famous and basically giving immeasurable service to our country, he was investing all of his money through his family back in Rhode Island in privateers. It did not go well. He's a great character. He has 12 volumes of letters and diaries, and to read them he's one of the most introspective people that I've seen in reading documents and letters of that period. He really examines himself. You wonder how he could ever become a general, because he's constantly saying, I doubt everything I do. I'm in storms of my own imagination. I can't make my mind up. It's a very personable guy, and he's introduced through privateering. His family's heavy investors. He has a very, I don't want to give it away, but he has a very unfortunate end. He dies right after the war, and he dies essentially thinking that his service for the country and what he fought for wasn't worth it. The Browns of Rhode Island, I mentioned them. Silas Dean, another character that we all sort of know. Silas Dean, he's from Connecticut. He was a lead commissioner in Europe. Went there before Benjamin Franklin did. He kind of laid a groundwork, preparing the way for Franklin. He was expelled from the honor roll of Revolutionary War contributors due to his involvement in privateering. It was said that he used government funds over there to make his initial investment. He had a lot of enemies in America. I think he's completely misjudged. I'm not saying he's a saint. He's a terrifically interesting and entertaining opportunist, but he did great work. And as I say in the book, he was, if I can remember it, I won't dig it out. He was a novice gambler. This is dealing with the French government. He said he was a novice gambler at a high-stakes table with very few cards to play. And he was there on his, he didn't even speak French very well. And he was told to go to the court and get supplies for America and get them to sign an alliance. And while he was there, he tried to make a little bit of money, and it brought him down terribly. Other names I'll throw out: William Bingham, 24 years old, went down as a political agent to the West Indies, came back 4 years later, the richest man in America, privateering. He himself said, I mastered the art of uniting war and commerce. That's what it was about for him. And finally, I'm going to end with two, not lofty characters, but two essentially no names that I ran across that left some writings that I think are very interesting. One, Christopher Vale, both teenagers during the war. Christopher Vale from Connecticut, joined a privateer, had an unbelievable experience where he was captured and did time on a British ship, did time in prison. At one point he's fighting on a French privateer against a British privateer. He just, all through his teens, he's having this, we call them adventures, but it obviously was pretty dreadful stuff. He's gone for almost 3 years. He comes back, his family's thrilled that he's alive. He has nothing, didn't make any money. 3 years, he's back home, he almost died in prison. 2 days later, 2 days, he hops another privateer and takes off. Back to sea. From New Hampshire, a contemporary, another teenager up in New Hampshire, his name is Andrew Sherburne. He also joins a privateer as a teenager. And he starts out lucky. And his first hit, he goes out, he's making $6 a month as a base pay. And he goes out on a ship, and they have a strike. They bring in a ship. And here's what he gets. This was his share of what they brought in. 1 ton of sugar, from 30 to 40 gallons of fourth proof Jamaica rum, about 20 pounds of cotton, approximately 20 pounds of ginger, logwood, allspice, and about $700 in paper money equal to $100 in specie, i.e. gold or silver. He's 14 years old. That's his take. But that's his high point. He is captured later, and at the very end of the war, he goes to the Jersey prison ship in the East River, now in Brooklyn Navy Yard, where if you went there, 3 out of 4 died on that ship. They were either thrown over the side. They were privateersmen mostly, not all. They were privateersmen. You were either thrown over the side. Usually you died at about a rate of about 8 per day, just of disease and starvation and exposure to the elements. If they weren't just thrown over the side, they were brought to the sort of the sandy banks there of what was now the Brooklyn Navy Yard and just buried in the shallows right there on the embankment. After the war, Sherburne goes back to New York. It's 5 years later. And he's in his early 20s now, and he goes back to collect. He did a little time on a Continental sloop, Ranger, and he wants to get his back pay. And he says it amounted to $73 worth at this time, due to the post-war recession, between 12 and 13 cents to the dollar. While he's there, from New Hampshire and New York, he decides to walk to the East River and look across at where the prison ship had lain, where he had done about 6 months' time. And he sees it's still there. It's sort of half done because the planking is sticking up through. And he says, and there yet lay that wretched old prison ship where I had suffered almost everything but death, and under which a large majority of my friends and shipmates had left their bones. And the thing that really gets him is that there's no marking. Life is going on. It's, the war is continuing. We're free. We have independence. And what he says next, I think, is the only thing you could say in that situation, looking across at this. He says, I shall not undertake to describe the sensations of my soul on that occasion. I don't think you can put into words what he must have thought, seeing that ship essentially unmarked. And some years later, it would go into the water. After the war, after this period, he had no money. He eventually became a chaplain in the War of 1812. He wrote a book, and he says right up front, I hope it makes a little money, because it will be my kids' only inheritance. But he writes it for another reason as well. He says he hopes that through the book, Americans may properly appreciate the freedom which they enjoy while they learn the price of its purchase. And he's obviously speaking about the dead and the wounded, and he was terribly, terribly wounded and never recovered. He walked with 2 canes mostly for the rest of his life. He's also talking, I think, about the cost it meant to America in terms of, you give. There were members of the American Congress that were disappointed at what happened to the American economy, how avarice had come involved. John Adams was a great supporter of privateering. He went back to Boston after the war. He was shocked. James Warren, another Boston dignitary, was amazed. He said, people that would not have shined my shoes 5 years ago are driving around in chariots. This was the nouveau riche. And one of the economists of the period says this had changed America. These were young entrepreneurs that risked all and made all, and they were running the show. And they were much more inclined to join in partnerships. They were able to buy onto the idea of a central bank in Philadelphia, that Alexander Hamilton, all these things that became the new America were forged to a great degree in privateering. So that's what the book ultimately meant for me, that patriot-pirate juxtaposition. And I think that's what Andrew Sherburne said. Well, there's a price to the purchase of our independence. We lost people, and we lost something of who we were. And it's not for us to say good or bad, but it was a revelation to me, and I hope maybe it'll be a revelation to some of you if anybody reads it. Thanks. If I went too long, I'm sorry. I'm happy to answer any questions, or if anybody, has a thought about the day or the weather or anything else. Yes, ma'am.
Any excavation or work that was done in that Brooklyn?
Well, it actually was. When they built the Brooklyn Navy Yard, they disinterred many of the bones, and Fort Greene has a huge crypt there, which has a very, very high tower, which used to be, you could go up on it and look over New York. And if you go to the crypt, I think is it an ossuary? Is that what they call it? Where you can look in and you can just see rooms full of bones because they don't know who they belong to. And that's there. But if it's visited by 100 people a year, I'll be shocked. But it's full. I mean, it's about as big as this room, and it's full of bones. And those were all disinterred when the Brooklyn Navy Yard was built. And those are from the British ships, the British prison ships. Yeah, Doug.
I have a sense that all these guys, this generation, got a taste of being pirates. Can't imagine it just turned off after the war. Would the seas then become more dangerous after the fact? Or
Well,
did they just reroute it to slave ships?
You know, I mean, the slave ship obviously to somewhat met that same impulse, certainly among the investors that followed it, you know. Whether, you know, a lot of them became freelance privateers and pirates on their own, I can't say for sure, but again, I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, John Paul Jones is a perfect example. He was trying to become a privateer. He wanted to join up with the French. He was offered to work, I think it was at the Argentine or one South American Navy wanted to bring him on, and they were casting about to put their skills to work. I can't really say whether we see you know, some sort of an uptick in lawlessness at sea, but I have to believe that it probably had some manifestation in some way, whether there was maybe they joined legal privateers from other countries or whatever. But I'm sure that happened. I'm sure that happened. Yeah.
What were the role of privateers in the War of 1812?
Well, they were very, very significant, and I won't claim to be an expert in it, but that same impulse came through, but it was the Navy was a little bit more established, I think, at that time. But privateering was again legalized in the War of 1812.
Did they have the letters of marque?
There were letters of marque, which I didn't get into, but there's a privateering commission, which is a straight-up warship. You know, we want to go. In fact, there's an interesting. Now that you mentioned it, I'll look at it. But a letter of marque was slightly different in that if you had a merchant ship or a fishing ship, and you could get a letter of marque which enabled you, if you happen to run across an unarmed vessel, and you know, if you had a letter of marque, you could legally capture it and bring it in, even though your ostensible main mission was trade or fishing. And I'm going to jump on, because I do have, there's a funny quote to Congress that came to them from a guy that was just that. He was seeking a letter of marque. And here's what he says. He generously informed, I'm sorry, it wasn't Congress, it was the Massachusetts Provincial Court. One man generously informed the General Court that he was preparing a fishing trip. And here's what he wrote them. For the good of the country and especially for the poor. But he would appreciate a letter of marque and 8 cannon if it could be spared. You know what I mean? And so he was very interested in fishing for the poor, but also he would like some cannon just in case he ran across you know, an unarmed you know, enemy merchant ship. Yes?
One more question. These privateers, what happened to the personnel that were manning the British trade ships? Did they kill them? Or?
Well, no. That's you know, it's a good point. What they did, first of all, they didn't want to. The British kept the American prisoners. One of the reasons John Paul Jones hated privateers was they didn't want to keep prisoners, because they looked at prisoners as dead weight. If you had British prisoners on your ship, you had to feed them, you had to take care of them, you had to guard them. They would go to the nearest port they could and just get rid of them. They didn't care. John Paul Jones was furious. He said, how are we ever going to exchange people if we keep giving away the prisoners that we're getting at sea? But also, of course, they were enticed to join the crew, which many did, of privateering. And also, some scams were run. American captains would run scams, too. They would give some of their captured British passengers or crewmen or whatever, they'd give them a little bit of money on the port, and they'd say, yeah, I'm here, and you know, I'll take care of you. Here's some money. Go buy yourself some food. And if they had, then they would go out and spend it all because they didn't know about American money that was worth nothing. You know, so they would just be. So then they have incidents where then they say, well, your only job I can offer you is to come be on my privateer and be a crewman, and they would do it because they had no other way to make a living in the New World. These people that had been captured. So very much they were incorporated, they were enticed to become part of the American effort.
They didn't kill them like
No, they did not kill them. No. It was, and even the British threatened more of the killing of the. They killed by accident theoretically in the prison ships. I mean that was thousands, but very few were just, you know, strung up on the yardarm. That was threatened all the time, but what they were kept was indefinitely in Britain and in the prison ships without any promise of exchange.
What anecdotes might you have from your famous grandfather, personal?
You know, I had to make a talk not long ago, and someone asked me to tell a story or two about my grandfather, and I'm happy to do it anytime. So I didn't know what to say, so I pulled 2 funny stories out about him, and I'll throw at you, just because I thought him off the cuff then. And after World War I, my grandfather was home at his home up in Massachusetts, and one thinks of General Patton as just being an expert with guns, and of course he was, but he would lay them all, they were toys to him, he would play with them. Well, he's upstairs at our home, my wife's been there many times with me up at where my mother lives now. He's upstairs in the master bedroom, cleaning all his guns, he's got all his swords laid out on the bed and whatever, and his wife Beatrice is having a tea party, very formal ladies' tea down on the floor below. And she's got a big glass-topped coffee table with her silver tea service, and all the ladies from the area are having their tea and whatever else they're having. And there's Georgie Patton upstairs with his swords and his guns, and he's cleaning his pistol, and it goes off. And it goes through the roof, up through the ceiling, and it goes through the coffee table, blows the coffee table to bits. All the coffee flies all over the place right there. And my grandmother, she looks up and she goes, I wish he'd be more careful. You know? And then the other one I always tell, is when he was in World War I, he got shot in the groin, and the bullet went out his buttock. and it took a large, about baseball-sized chunk out of one cheek. And after the war, he was very proud of this, so he took his bathing suit and he took a pair of scissors and he cut a big high cut up under the bathing suit so it would show his entire right buttock, and he got thrown off the beach at Narragansett, Rhode Island for indecent exposure. So there's two stories for you, Yes, ma'am.
I have a more recent question.
Yes.
This is regarding the current GI bill in Congress.
I'll give you what I can. I don't know.
The bill said that the returning GIs should get an opportunity at further education,
Yes.
which Senator McCain said no. What is your opinion?
You know what? That's a very interesting...
You and I were from the same army background.
Yeah, you know what? There was an argument against it that I saw put forth by the Bush administration having to do with that a lot of it was covered and that it was sort of overkill. But I know that a lot of congressmen and military men that I respect really feel that it was important to give them all that one could give them. And I hate to be no more specific than that, but my response was, if it's just a few dollars, if it's just dollars, frankly, to me, I'm one of those. It's like me when you talk about education in town in Darien. I'm ready to throw all the money at education. Now, give the schools what they need, give the libraries what they need. I say give the soldiers what they need. So that's me, But that doesn't mean I'm right. I heard there were arguments, and I thought, oh, maybe there was something within this that maybe makes it unnecessary or contradictory or too expensive. But in general, my impulse was, why wouldn't we do that?
Can we discuss it, or?
Well, I'm no expert in it, ma'am. I'm happy to throw out anything. I just, I read newspapers on that, and I have no more knowledge than that. So you're talking to just one vote, one man right here, Yes.
In the war, was ransoming any kind of a significant?
What ransoming was you could capture a ship or a crew, and you could take a piece of paper. And you might take a man as well. Let's say you would take the captain of the ship, and he would sign a piece of paper that says, this ship has been captured. I'm staying with the people that captured me. They're going to let the ship go, and the owner of the ship has to find a way to get the payment back for this vessel. And what the Royal Navy loved ransoming because they didn't want to put prize crews, otherwise you had to put 15, 20, 30 of your men onto whatever ship you'd captured to sail it home. If you ransomed it, it could sail. It was obligated under the rules of honor at that time to get itself home, and you were then, to find the payment from the ship's owner back to, from the person that had owned what would have been otherwise fallen into the hands of the.
But as subsequent to the Privacy Act, were the British ship owners obligated to make good on those notes?
Yeah, they were, and Britain specifically outlawed it because it was being used against them. Because, yes, and it was very interesting because it showed how, and in fact one historian puts it, suddenly the tables had turned. It was now helping it was helping American cruisers, ships, voyage longer, keep their crews longer because they were able to take pieces of paper. So the British government actually specifically had a law, I forget, it might have been a 500-pound penalty or whatever, if anyone, it was illegal to take ransom notes instead of bringing home a capture. So that was interpreted by historians as a sign that what had been quite favored by the Royal Navy, they did not like anymore because it was being used against them.
Yeah, Bob,
like
just
one
one more question.
Sure, Bob.
Based on all of your studies in this area, of an area that I think is kind of below the radar screen of most people who look at the Revolutionary War, if this patriotic thievery hadn't gotten itself mobilized, do you think the turn of the war would have been different?
It's funny. George Washington said that all the naval activity, of which we know now that the bulk of it was civilian run, was, quote, the pivot on which everything turned. It really seems to me that, again, taking nothing away from the Continental Army and what they did, but like any insurgency, you win by not losing. And his essential mission was not to get beat, to pick his battles, and if he was going to get trapped, to pull back. And Nathaniel Greene, I mentioned as having made his great name in the Southern campaigns, he is famous for never having won a battle. He never won a battle. All he did was fight, deliver what damage he could, and get out of there, and then move and fight. And so and I actually mentioned my grandfather in the book in reference to that. My grandfather was once asked what makes a great general, and he sort of gruffly said, not to be beaten. And that's exactly what made Nathaniel Greene a great general. He did not win a battle. But as he said early on, he said, but the cost of their victory was too dear for them to have too many more victories like that. And so in a way, the Continental Army had that same mission. Would that have been enough overall? I'm not sure. Whether it was done through an ultimate American uniform Navy or the privateers, we needed to hit them in their pocketbooks. That's essentially what turned the British population against the war. They were tired of it. They felt they wouldn't lose that much if they just let the American colonies go. And in fact, the argument was put forward that was even better. They wouldn't have the burdens of colonial administration, but they would still have the American trade. And in great measure, that's what happened. Yeah.
Thank you, Bob.
Oh, good.